Excellent. With the recording started. So, hi everyone. I'm so glad that everyone could make it today. We're kicking this thing off. My name is Floor. I'm one of the organizers of these Postgres extension ecosystem mini summits, which is a mouthful. This is a series of free and online mini summits leading up to the session that we'll be holding at Postgres at the Postgres Development Conference this May in Montreal. Other organizers are also here: David Wheeler from Tembo, Yuri from Omnigress, Keith from Crunchy Data. This stream and the closed captions that will be published with it are being supported by the Postgres Development Conference, PGConfDev, and their gold level sponsors, Google, AWS, Huawei, Microsoft, and my employer, EDB. So next and last in this series, in May, we're going to have Gabriele Bartolini talk to us about extension management in Cloud Native PG. So definitely make sure you head over to the meetup page if you haven't already, and make sure that you RSVP for that one. That is just going to be a couple of days before the conference takes place. So we'll be fresh in memory when we hold the summit there. And for the penultimate edition of this series, we're inviting a couple of Postgres extension and tooling users to talk about how they pick and choose projects that they want to use, how they do their due diligence, and sort of their experience with running extensions to do a thing. So we've invited Celeste from Aiven, Sonia from Percona, and Alexey from FerretDB, and they will get the chance to introduce themselves a bit more in a little bit. But I just wanted to sort of like set the context for the meeting today. Because we thought that, like being in the depth of it all, if you're an extension developer, you kind of lose the perspective of what it's like to use extensions and other auxiliary tooling. You sort of like lose that user's point of view. But users, maybe they're coming from other ecosystems, are used to maybe a different, probably smoother experience. So like for me, I'm coming from the Rails and Ruby community. And so for me, Ruby gems are my sort of like one-stop shop for extending functionality for a thing. And that's definitely a completely different experience from when I got into Postgres and started using extensions. That's not to say, by the way, that those ecosystems and npm and pip and WordPress don't come with their own issues, but we can certainly learn from some of the differences between the different ecosystems. And I think ultimately what we want to cover today is what is the experience of using extensions in 2025 or right now, and what are users' wishes for the future. Yeah. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we can see our wonderful panelists for today. And I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves one by one. I think I'm going to start with Celeste.
Hello, hello, hello. So my name is Celeste. I'm on the developer relations team at Aiven. I guess I come at all of this as a relatively new Postgres user. I only really started using Postgres as a part of my job here at Aiven, but a sort of much longer contributor to similar sized ecosystems, in that I was really heavily involved in the Kubernetes ecosystem for quite a while, which Kubernetes is a sort of design extensible by design piece of software, but it's many generations of software development later than some of the concepts that Postgres pioneered. So that's kind of the perspective that I'm here to bring. Thank you for having me, Floor.
Well, thanks for being here. Sonia, can you tell us next, how did you get into this mess or Postgres in the first place? And what do you sort of do day to day?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everybody. So I started working with PostgreSQL in the year 2012, and since then it has been quite a bit of journey. So Postgres has been my primary database, and along with the learning of PostgreSQL, I learned the other database alongside. So I learned Oracle, I learned SQL Server, but only from the perspective which is important to migrate from Postgres to X database. So Postgres to like X database to PostgreSQL. So as an Oracle to PostgreSQL migration, SQL Server to PostgreSQL migration. So over the like on the go, I learned the other databases. And I'm fortunate enough to get opportunities to work as a PostgreSQL developer, PLPG developer, PostgreSQL DBA, on-site coordinator, off-site coordinator, sometimes a trainer. So in and out, it has been like for me, I'm breathing PostgreSQL since then.
Awesome. Alexey, can you go next?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. So first worked with Postgres in 2005. I was sitting there and trying to remember around that time. I was working in a company where all business logic was written in PostgreSQL start procedures. That was pretty bad. And you can imagine the old version of Postgres it was. It was like very old version, no after vacuum, no a lot of other useful functionality. It was pretty bad. Fast forward to today, and I'm doing FerretDB is open source MongoDB replacement built on top of PostgreSQL, and also on top of DocumentDB extension recently open sourced by Microsoft. So we like provide this extension to our users, but also we consume this extension as users of that extension ourselves. Somewhere in between 2005 and now, I also worked in Percona. At Percona, I worked on monitoring software and worked with pgstat statement, pgstat monitor, which is made by Percona, and yeah, have pretty much a lot of experience with PostgreSQL extensions.
Yeah, exactly. You're cheating a little bit, I think, on this panel, seeing as you're not only a user but also a provider, and we'll talk about that, I think, in a little bit as well. I definitely have some questions for you, and you all talked a little bit already about your sort of experience with extensibility of other software or technology, and comparing that to the Postgres experience. Is there, can you all, in the same order, I guess, still talk about sort of what the main differences are that you have observed with other ecosystems? So I would say that Celeste goes first again.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think as somebody who's a bit of a newer Postgres user and I guess comes from a different community, the biggest thing that weirded me out when I started working with Postgres is that really there's no way to install an extension except to install it against like your live database. If you compare that to something like Kubernetes, which again has a rather robust extensibility ecosystem, both on the networking side of things, but also other aspects of it, the inherent sort of like software architecture of Kubernetes makes it so that you kind of have to plan out what you're going to do and then you apply a plan. And in theory, you can't apply a plan or add extensions to Kubernetes that like won't work or will somehow break the system. Again, in theory, in practice, things are more interesting. But with Postgres and with databases in general, you're always working with the live data set, or like at some point you have to work with the live data set. Like, so there's no real way to test. That was the thing that kind of got me when I first started working with Postgres. So that's my take on it.
Great. Sonia, do you want to add anything? Especially looking at maybe other databases that you're familiar with.
So most of the other databases apart from PostgreSQL, which I have worked, most of them are licensed. So Oracle, SQL Server. So when it comes to PostgreSQL, it's an open source. So you do your own thing. You do the installation, do check out everything which is open source. You can see the code and things like that. But when it comes to other databases, I haven't. I mean, it's since it's licensed, it is managed by the specific vendor as such. So you do not have rights to do anything else. But yeah, the things which will be common, like you do the POC in both the databases before you actually implement it in the production environment.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, Yeah. Flor, you mentioned that Ruby gems, and I was thinking that actually there is something similar between PostgreSQL extensions and Ruby gems, in the sense that Ruby gems quite often extend built-in Ruby classes, monkey patch, everything, and then Postgres extensions could do the same. There is no separation between public and private API inside PostgreSQL. That's all just C symbols, like no special marking. Okay, don't touch this API. We are going to change it at central detail. Nothing like that. They try not to break compatibility needlessly, but on the other hand, you have to check all versions of your extensions with all supported versions of your extensions with all supported versions of PostgreSQL. So in that sense, it's quite similar, I would say, unlike some other languages where there is like better separation between internal private API. If not on the compiler level, at least on like documentation level or something like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
fair enough. Yeah.
And
I think
this
one
isn't necessary,
thing.
sorry, Flor, to interrupt. That's not necessarily a criticism of Postgres. I think it's actually, it's just those were the tools available to Postgres as a community when Postgres was being developed. And there's some advantages to that too, because that, for lack of a better word, like the lack of checks and balances, let some Postgres extensions do very, very interesting things that would maybe not be possible under a more restricted framework, right? Sorry to interrupt you, Flora.
Not at all. When someone starts talking about Ruby and Rails side, I just want to. So I think my main difference, like the main difference I see between those two is just like I know to go to Ruby Gems as my sort of like place to get my plugins or my gems, I guess in that case. Whereas with Postgres, they can live pretty much anywhere, right? There's different directories and there's different places where you can get your stuff, and maybe there's something that is in a private repo somewhere because that's what another team at your company is working on. It's a bit of a mess, and it's really difficult to navigate where maybe other things are a lot less difficult to navigate because there's just a single place, I think. Maybe piggy banking on that. Well, I want to talk a little bit about when you're looking for an extension to do a certain thing for you. What do you consider when you're looking for an extension or when you're comparing maybe some of the tooling? So I wrote down a couple of things that you might be looking at, or what I might be looking at is like maybe it's docs and tutorials, maybe has it seen a recent release, has it seen frequent releases? Is there only one company that is offering this extension, or is it multiple companies supporting this extension? Is it a community built tool? Is it already, like I said, maybe in use by other teams in your company? So it's something that has already been tested out with your system, with your stack, and so you feel like that's something that you can easily adopt. Yeah. So what are some of the things for you that you definitely look at when you're looking to adopt new tooling? Celeste, can you go first again? I'm just going to keep this really simple for myself and just do it in order.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the main thing you want to look for when you're looking at really any open source project, whether it's an extension or not, is both kind of proof points within the project, but also social proof, if that makes any sense. So proof points within the project are things that you mentioned, like, is there documentation? Does this seem to be actively maintained? Like, is the commit log in GitHub moving? How many open issues are there? Are those open issues being closed over time? That's one set of things. Those are project health indicators. And for example, if you look at the Chaos project, Don Foster has done a ton of work around measuring project health there. But I think the other half of this, and this was actually something we worked on a lot at the Cloud Native Computing Foundation when I was there, and that work continues, and this makes a bit more sense in some cases than others, is social proof. So are there other companies using it? Can you point to case studies? Can you point to case studies of something being in production? Can you point to people giving conference talks where they mention something being in use? This becomes really, really important when you start thinking about things being enterprise grade and when you start thinking about the idea of enterprise grade open source. Because that's really, I mean, everybody who's on this panel works for a company that does enterprise grade open source database software. And you have to ask yourself what that means. And a lot of what that means is that other enterprises are using it because that means that something comes to a certain level of reliability.
Got it. Sonia, do you want to do you want to take over?
I would like to add some things. I mean, what do I see? So, how difficult or how easy it is to install, configure, and upgrade the extension which we are going to use it, and whether it needs restart of the database service or not. Why do I look at the restart aspect? Because when I install it or configure or upgrade or whatever activity I perform with it, in that case, if it requires the restart, that means it is not configured online. So I need to involve other folks as well to do the database restart, as in maybe an application is connecting to it. So when I restart, it goes for a maintenance window for a very small time or whatever duration it goes for, like it goes offline, the database service. So whether it requires restart or not, that is also very important for me to understand. Like apart from the documentation, which should be, of course, easy to understand, that is one of the aspects while you install and configure the same. But yeah, restart is something which is very important for me. Again, how easy it is to use that extension. So it should not be that difficult that I need to refer every time everything and do it, and then maybe I might need to create another script to use it. It should not be the case. I to look at those aspects as well. Apart from that, I also see how do I monitor the activities of this extension, like whether it is available in the logs, what that extension is doing. So it should not break my existing things, basically. So how stable and how durable it is, and I should be able to monitor the activities, whatever that extension is doing. But from the durability perspective, even if I'm not able to monitor via logs, it should be durable enough to that it should not break anything else which is up and running. So yeah, these are the things.
That's the dream, right? It shouldn't break anything. Okay, cool.
I forgot one point to add. I will definitely perform the POC before putting it into the production, into some lower environment or in my test environment somewhere else.
How do you figure out though how easy something is to sort of set up and configure? Are you looking for that information from a README or some documentation? Because I've definitely seen some very poorly documented stuff out there. I think we all have. Yeah.
Yeah, documentation is one aspect. Apart from that, when you do the POC, you'll be actually using that. So with that POC itself, you'll be able to understand how easy it is to install, configure, and use it.
Great. Alexey, how about you? What are you looking at?
Yeah, so for me as a user, I would say the most important thing is whatever the extension is packaged and easy to install. And if it's not packaged in the same way as PostgreSQL is packaged, for example, if I get PostgreSQL from my Ubuntu distribution, if extension is not in the same Ubuntu repository, it might as well not exist for me. Because there is no way I'm going to compile it myself. With like hundreds of compilation flags and that being C, and okay, I can make it 1% faster, but then it will be insecure and will bring PostgreSQL down or worse. So there are a lot of problems like that, and yeah, if it's not a package, then I would just probably just do something which is not as good, not as stable, but I will do it myself and will be able to support them using some third-party extension that is not packaged properly. And properly for me is like the high bar. So if it's like some third-party network of extensions, that might be okay. I will take a look, but then of course, if it's in the Ubuntu repository or Debian repository or PG development group repository, that would be of course much better.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit of the sort of build versus buy, or I guess not necessarily buy if it's open source. Not to say that open source is free, but that's a little bit the discussion, right? Like when do you decide to spend the time to build something over or adopting something? And so for you, that's mainly due to like down to packaging. Yes?
Yeah, for me that's the most important one because for features we generally need to use like in the current job and previous jobs, there are enough hooks in the PostgreSQL itself to make what we want to do ourselves. Like if sometimes we need to parse logs, sometimes we need to parse some low-level counters, but that's doable and we could do it in a different language and in the way we can maintain it ourselves. If we talk about PostgreSQL extensions, they typically written in C. If there's some problem, we will have a bigger problem finding someone to maintain it, to fix it for us.
All right. So, and then when you build it yourself, would you then also open source it yourself and take on the burden of, that of maintenance?
Well, or you'll just not open source it. That depends, of course.
Or you will just not open source it?
Yeah.
What is that attitude?
I mean, that's really depends on the job. Like at Percona, we open source PG start statement, but that was like, oh, sorry, PG start monitor, but that was like implicit goal of making this extension open source to make it like a superset of PG state statement. In FerretDB, of course, DocumentDB is open source. We contribute to it, but I couldn't say that's easier. And of
Yeah.
course, it was written like in our uh, perfect language Go, it would be much, much easier. Fortunately, it's not, so we have to deal with it with packaging and whatnot.
Yeah. I guess it's also sort of like build versus buy versus fork because there's definitely different forks available for a similar tooling that is just optimized for a little bit of a different use case. But again, that's then another project out there that needs to be maintained and people need to consider.
Yeah, but on the same time, if you fork something and don't want to contribute it back, you just don't have this problem of maintaining it for someone else. You just maintain it for yourself. That's generally easy, of course. Like if someone else in the upstream wants to pull your changes, they will be able to, and then will look at you like you're a bad uh, part of the community because you don't contribute back. But that depends again. That depends on the size of the company, whatever you have resources and
Okay,
all
see,
that.
but
So
now you're touching on something that I feel very strongly about when it comes to
I knew
open
this was going
source.
to trigger you,
And
Celeste.
I'm not gonna let it slide, Alexey. I'm sorry. Which is, well, okay, so why open source anything to begin with? Like, if we can all just maintain closed forks of everything that we need, why is Postgres open source to begin with? And why does it continue to be open source? And why are we having this discussion 30 or 40 years into the lifespan of Postgres at this point, right? Um, the fact of the matter is that Postgres being open source is the reason that we're still here today. Postgres is a 30-plus-year-old database at this point. Yes, it's extremely well architected because it continues to be applicable to modern use cases when it comes to data. But really, the fundamental of the matter is that it is free. And being free means that two things can happen. It means that one, it's a very smart move for businesses to build a business on top of a particular piece of software. But two, and I would argue that this is actually the more important point when it comes to open source and the long-term viability of open source, um, is that because it is free, that means it is A, proliferative. It has proliferated across the software industry. And B, that means it is extremely valuable for professionals to learn Postgres or to learn Kubernetes or to learn Linux because they know that they're going to encounter that sometime in their career. So when it comes to extensions, why open source an extension? You could simply close source an extension, right? It's the same reason though. It's because if you use open source extensions, you can then hire for people who have potentially encountered those extensions before, right? That said, again, I work for a managed service provider that deploys quite a few Postgreses for quite a few clients. I obviously have a bit of a stake in the build versus buy versus fork debate that is entirely financial and entirely linked to my well-being. Um, regardless, it still makes sense for a company like Aiven to invest in open source technologies, but it makes a lot more sense for us to hire Postgres experts who can then manage those extensions and manage the installation of those extensions and manage like whether your database works or not against certain extensions than it is for literally every company out there on the planet to hire a Postgres professional, right? Like there's still a use case for open sourcing these things. That is a much larger discussion, though, and I don't want to derail this panel.
Not at all. I mean, if Alexey is game, you got yourself a conversation.
Okay, let's do it. Yeah, I mean,
I
yeah,
love this.
yeah. First of all, I completely agree with you, and I, of course, built my whole career on open source. So, like, yeah, I agree with you. But there is also the other side. So let's say yes, you built an open source extension which is very specific, very niche, solves your particular problem, and there are like 20 other people who are like you have the same problem, and then all 20 come to your GitHub and ask questions about it. And they do it for free, you just waste your time supporting them essentially. And you're a small company, you're just three people, and you open source this extension just for fun, and they are three people, and two of them work full time in support.
Oh yeah, no, I didn't say the economics of this worked out for the people doing the open sourcing, just to be perfectly clear. And that is, I think, a like much larger question around the sustainability of open source communities in general. Like Postgres, the overall project, and say, for example, Kubernetes, like the main Kubernetes projects, are outliers in terms of the amount of support and the amount of sort of manpower and people and energy they get. Whereas, like most things that get open source are, I think Tidelift does a survey. I don't know if they still do the survey. I haven't seen the more recent years of the survey, but the average maintainer size for any given open source project is one. That is like a much larger debate, though, which is like realistically, it makes a lot of sense, particularly for larger companies, to use open source software, Postgres included, because it accelerates their time to innovation. They don't need to worry about developing a database, for example. And for example, if they're using Postgres and they decide they want time series data, they don't need to worry about migrating to a time series database when they can just use timescale, right? However, are they necessarily contributing back to those projects becomes a really big question. And I think like one of the next questions that Flora would like to lead us to, and I'm just gonna take the reins, Flora.
Wait, are you taking my job?
Hardly. I could never
It
organize.
turns out I don't need to be
that.
afraid about AI taking my job. It's just it's Celeste. Yeah.
But there's a question around how my understanding too of why we're having this series of conversations that's around the sustainability of the Postgres extensions ecosystem. And there's a governance question there as well, which is for the end user, the ideal state for any Postgres extension is that they're like blessed and vetted by the central project. But as soon as you start doing that, you start realizing how limited the resources of even a massive project like Postgres are, right? And then you start asking, well, where should those people be coming from? And then you start thinking, there are companies like Microsoft out there in the world that are hiring a lot of open source contributors, and that's great. But what about the governments? What about the universities? What about the smaller companies? Like the real issue is the manpower, and there's only so far you can go as a result of that. And there's always sustainability issues around all open source, including Postgres extensions, that come down to the sustainability of open source as a whole and whether or not this is a reasonable way of developing software. Sorry to get deep.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I think that those are the discussions that we're having, a lot in the open source community. I see that David is posting lol in the in the in the chat, which probably means lol sub or something. Jan is trying to be quiet. Yeah, I think these are discussions that we're definitely having, in the open source community and in the hallway at a lot of conferences. Uh, yeah. Um, Maybe we're gonna open it up to audience questions too, or participant questions too in a minute. So if people want to continue talking about the drama that is open source and sustainable open source, we can definitely continue this discussion. Maybe going back a little bit, Alexey, can we talk a little bit about, because you're also a provider, sort of like what your definition of done is, or what you want to offer your users at minimum, when you do decide to open source some of your stuff or make available some of your stuff. Whew.
Yeah. As an open source company, what we do, we just publish a code on GitHub, and that's it. That's open source. That's done. Knock yourself out. And if you want some support, you just pay us, and then we will. That's how we make money. Well, of course not. That's more complicated than that, and I wish it was like that to some degree sometimes. No, there is still a lot of users who just come and ask for questions for free, and you want to support them because you want to increase adoption and all that. The same with extensions. So, as I just described the situation, of course, that was a bit like not to provoke a discussion, but let's say you build a PostgreSQL extension. You need to have some hooks in the core that ideally would be stable, don't change between versions. As we discussed, that's a bit of a problem, PostgreSQL, no separation between private and public API. Then how do you install? You need to package it some way that is the same way as your current PostgreSQL version is packaged. There is no easy way, for example, to extend a version of PostgreSQL, which is a part of Docker container. You just build your own container, effectively revoking the whole things they already did for you. Then what? Then how do you update it? Updating extensions is also quite complicated. I lost my phone.
Here, I'll segue into the point that I think I was supposed to make when we were talking about
the
extensions ecosystem, as opposed to a rant about the sustainability of open source, which I am unfortunately always down to give. So here's the thing with extensions ecosystems. Again, for the end user, it is significantly more beneficial if those extensions are somehow centrally controlled. If you think about something like Ruby gems or like the Python package installer or even Docker to a certain extent, those are all ways of centralizing that. Though obviously with some of the exploits that have gone on with NPM recently, like there are obviously still problems there, right? And as I mentioned, there's always staffing problems when it comes to open source. So kind of assigning somebody to approve every single like extension under the sun isn't really sustainable from a human perspective. The way that we handle this in the Kubernetes community with particularly the container network interfaces, of which there are many, 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 is we effectively managed it with governance. We have a page on the documentation in the website that basically says, here are all the container network interfaces that have chosen to list themselves with us. The listings are alphabetical, so there is no like order of precedence. The community does not take responsibility for this code because we simply cannot. And in being a container network interface, it means that they implement certain functionalities like it is like an interface in the programming sense of that. And we sort of just left it at that. That was the solution that the Kubernetes community came to. I don't know if that's the solution that the Postgres community will eventually come to, but community governance is a huge part of the solution to that problem, in my opinion.
Yeah, so I think one big difference between NPM and Node.js ecosystem in general, and for example, PostgreSQL extensions, that NPM is so popular and there are so many packages, mostly because Node.js by itself is quite small. the core of Node.js is really, really small. There is no standard library and a lot of functionality is external. So I would say like as long as your core like PostgreSQL or Ruby or Kubernetes is large enough, the amount of extensions will be limited just by that because many people will not use any extensions, they will just use the core. And that could solve a problem of like waiting and all this like I don't know, domain, not domain, but name squatting and all that, but just by itself. And I would say PostgreSQL more or less solves this problem to some degree.
Right. To change pace a little bit, I wanted to, before we open up for some questions from participants here, is that Sonia in a previous call shared a little bit of a horror story with us with wanting to use a certain extension and not being able to. And I think this is maybe something that other people can sort of resonate with as well, having been to a similar thing. And so maybe let's hear that story, and then also, of course, Celeste, Alexey, if you have similar stories, do share before we open up for questions from the rest of the peeps joining here.
So there was this requirement to transfer data from one database to another database, specifically with respect to PostgreSQL. So I wanted to transfer the data from non-production to not from like from the production environment to some other environment or internally within the non-production environments. So I created this extension called DB Link. I'm talking about in the year way back 2012 2013 somewhere when I started working with PostgreSQL. I used that extension, and when you use that extension or when you configure that extension, we need to give the credentials in a human readable format, and then at times it also gets stored in the logs or somewhere. Oh, I mean, even if it is not stored in the logs, the issue which they were like the security team or the audit team mentioned was that since it is using the credentials in a human readable format, this is not good. And if somebody has an extension, I mean, has an access to X database, they also get the access to the Y database or the Y cluster. And what if it goes to the production environment and then somebody can just steal the data also? Without even knowing or without we even knowing it. And I mean, it will not get logged inside the logs also at times, that somebody has accessed my production database via non-production database. So that's not good. And that was not acceptable by the auditors when they were doing the audit. So I love that extension today also, because without doing any scripting or anything, you just access one database from another database and then get whatever you want. But then as a developer, yeah, it might be very easy for me to use that thing. But then as an other person who is trying to snook into your production database or the other data of anything, it's easy for them. So then we were asked not to use that extension specifically, at least not to
Yeah.
connect to the production environment.
Yeah.
Because
So even though that's that was
way
their tooling
back,
of choice.
I'm sorry to interrupt. So way back, I was working for a taxation project. It was a financial critical data, and they did not wanted to have any risk of, to anybody reaching to that data, because it was the numbers, the financial figures, and it was critical. So that's the reason we were refrained from using it for that particular project. But then other projects which were not that critical, I somehow managed to convince them to use it.
Yeah. So it's sometimes, you will choose it for your own convenience, and then there might be restrictions from other teams as well. All right, cool. Thanks for sharing that. If anyone wants to unmute and ask questions or share their own horror stories, you're now very welcome to. I've seen some people in the chat that were, very wanted to speak up. So now is your moment. You're allowed to.
Thanks for
And Jay,
allowing me.
you don't have to raise your hand either. You can just speak up. We're that informal of a crew. Yuri.
Yes, I'm here. I was listening very carefully, but everything that has been discussed, and I think there was a really good point about extensions being available as part of your operating system environment. That is, for example, Ubuntu packages or Red Hat packages and other thing. This is where we still have a lot of difficulty in general in this ecosystem. So obviously PGDG is doing an amazing job capturing a fraction of those extensions, but because it is a complicated job, right? Oftentimes even perhaps unpaid, people trying to, to make the best out of it. So on the one hand, it does serve as a filter, as in only the best of the best extensions that the people really use get through that filter, so they become part of PGDG distribution. But it also creates an impediment. That is, for example, PGDG is not always able to update them as the releases come out, and oftentimes people do need the latest, the best releases available, and not when the packagers have time. And the other problem is, how do you get other extensions become popular if they're not there in the first place? So it creates that kind of problem where you're stuck with what you have, right? And there's a problem with A, discovery, like how do I find them? And B, how do I trust this builds, or can I even get those builds for my operating system? So obviously there are some efforts that try to mitigate that by, say, building a Docker container and you run them, with just copies of those files. But obviously there's a demand for a native deployment method. That is, if I deploy my Postgres this way, say using RPM and my Red Hat based distro or Debian based, I want everything else to fall into that. I don't want a new system. So I think we still have a lot of work to do on that end. Like I've been putting some effort on our end to try and find how can we save packagers time. That is basically decrease the amount of work that needs to be done. Can we go essentially from here's the URL for the extension, figure it out, like 80% of them. Can we just figure them out and package them automatically and repackage them when new versions come out, and only assign people on them, for the remaining 20% that are not sort of built in according to a certain convention, so they need some attention. And so this way we can actually get more extensions out and extract more value out of these extensions. And by using them, we're essentially helping the authors of those extensions gain a wider audience and effectively create value for everybody in the community. Otherwise, they would feel just, I can't really promote this as well as I would have loved to. Like, for example, in other ecosystems, Ruby gems were mentioned today in NPM, etc. It's easy to get your stuff out there. Whereas in Postgres community, it is not easy to get your stuff out there. And because there are so many risks associated with that, we are oftentimes working with production data, right? We need to make sure there is less friction on any other side. Like we need to get these extensions to get considered. So that's at least one of the points that I wanted to mention. So I think there's a lot to be done, and I really hope that the conference next month in Montreal will actually be a great place to get the best minds together again and hash out some of the ideas that we've been discussing in the past, number of months. So definitely a very interesting part of the ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. There was another conference that was discussed in the chat as well during, but that's not the one that we're working towards. David, do you want to maybe ask your question of where people go to learn more about extensions and find their extensions?
Yeah, this is something that I tried to solve like a while ago with a modicum of success a bit. But yeah, my question is, where do you all go to learn more about extensions, to find out what extensions are available, or if you have, is there an extension that does XYZ? How do you find out if there is and then evaluate it and where you go? Anybody?
I generally just search, I guess. I don't go to any centralized place. I generally use search, and quite often I land on some blog post, on sometimes on GitHub repo itself, like that, yeah.
Yeah, I
For
would
me,
say so. Like, if you think about that sort of like project level activity proof and then the social proof, I think that Postgres actually has a really unique advantage compared to a lot of other open source projects because it's been going for so long and because there is a very entrenched community. It's very easy to find social proof for basically anything Postgres related that you might want. So if you do search, like, I want a Postgres extension that does X, you're going to get comparatively better like Google search results because there's years and years and years of search results in some cases. However, that does come with the opposite, equal and opposite problem of like, then you have maintenance issues because things have been going for years and years and years and years, and you don't know whether things have been maintained or not. Um, I'm thinking about this from like an open source management perspective, and as somebody who is not necessarily involved in the open source development of Postgres, I think there is a case that you could make for some amount of community vetting of some extensions and publicizing that community vetting and sort of having effectively a small subset of like this has some sort of seal of approval that it's not going to like nuke your database. And to a certain extent, I think Postgres actually already does that because it does ship with a set of extensions by default. And in shipping with those extensions, it's effectively saying the upstream Postgres community blesses these such to that we will ship Postgres with them because we are pretty confident that these are not going to nuke your database. But another sort of, I'm just again trying to, when I was at the CNCF, I supported like a whole bunch of different open source projects. I was like everybody's documentation girl. So I'm trying to like, like, I'm trying to just like throw things at them and then hopefully you can talk about them in Montreal and maybe something useful will come of it. Like another thing that you can use, is almost like an alpha beta experimental sort of feature where like you define some set of criteria for something being alpha or experimental. You define some set of criteria that if met, they can call themselves beta. You define some set of criteria of something being quote unquote production ready for an extensions ecosystem. And like then you can kind of have people submit applications and then it's like less of a mad rush maybe. Again, I guess if I had any advice, not that Postgres needs my Charlton advice, it would be like you have to think about how you want to manage this from like a community governance perspective, or else you will find yourself in like utter mayhem. Like there's a reason that like the Kubernetes like container network interface pages specifies that things have to be listed in alphabetical order. It's because there was mayhem until we decided to list things in alphabetical order. Like it seems completely silly, but like it is real.
So my next project is going to start with AA, I guess.
Exactly, or numbers. Alexey, do you wanna talk to where you get your information around extensions? Where do you even start your journey?
No, for me that's just search. I think the biggest source of information for me is someone was passionate enough to write a blog post about something. Then I will take a look.
It's Sonia, how about you?
Yeah, what Celeste said. I will research about it online normally, and I will find something. And if I get lots of options for doing X thing, a lot of extensions basically, I will go and literally search the documentation on postgresql.org and then try to figure out which one is the one to start with my POC. So yeah.
So let me flip the question for you, Sonia.
Yeah.
In an ideal world,
Mm-hmm.
if you were to try and find an extension to use for a particular task, how would you find that extension in an ideal world?
Yeah, normally I will research it, like Google it most of the times, and then try to find out,
But
get the blog
pretend you
posts.
don't have to Google it. Pretend that maybe there's like a website or a resource. What would your ideal way of doing that be? Like if you had some way that would give you like more of a guarantee that it was trustworthy or like would make it easier to find or like something. Like would it be a tool like Ruby Gems? Would it be like a page on the Postgres website's documentation? Like
Page. Yeah, the Postgres
page.
website
Okay.
documentation. Yeah, that's where that Postgres documentation is like a Bible for me. So I keep researching on that. In fact, previously when you used to Google out anything, you used to get the initial link as the postgresql.org, the website. Nowadays, you don't get the link as the first link, but then I will scroll down to the page. I will try to figure out where it is postgresql.org and then go there. That's the first thing. And then I okay, fine. Now, since I've been into the field since a very long time, then I know, okay, this website is authentic. Okay, I can go and check out the blogs, like who other people have, who else has used it or what is their experience or things like that.
Awesome. Okay, I promised Jay that he could go up next.
No,
And
it's okay. Can you hear me?
absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so I have to ask this only because I am new to thinking about Postgres outside of how I interact with it from a web developer's perspective, which is usually I use some ORM, I use some, module. I'm a Python developer, so I use Python, and then from there, I don't think about my database ever again. And now I want to think about it more. I want to have a very strong relationship with it. And we live in a world where you have to say that, like, one of the answers is going to be AI. One of the answers is I search for something, I get some AI response, and here's like the exactly. So this is the problem. If I don't know what I should do, and I get a response, when the response could have just been use this extension, it does everything you need to do and it makes your life so much easier. Instead, I wind up spending days, if not weeks, going in and fighting against the system itself. So Sonia, you mentioned having that experience, kind of the idea or the ability to discern when to go with some very kludgy Postgres function that makes your life miserable to, oh, there's an extension for this already, I'm just going to use that. How do you expose that to people who are they're not dumb, they're not vibe coding, they just finally have a reason to actively think about what their database is doing behind the scenes?
If I understood your question correctly, you wanted to explore how, like, what kind of activities a specific extension is doing.
I would just love the hey, you're trying to do a thing. This has already been solved in this extension over here, so you don't have to think about it. Or you're trying to do something brand new. No one's thought about this before, or people have thought about it before and talked about how much of a pain it is. Maybe you should create an extension that does this. And here's the steps to do that. Where is the proper documentation around coming to that decision? Or the community support for it?
That's a great question to discuss inside the community, to be honest. Like, how do we go about that?
Come to Montreal and help us figure it out.
I was afraid of that answer. I'll see you in New York or hopefully Chicago on Friday.
Fair enough. But definitely a wonderful question that we should note down for the discussion, I think, David. Yeah. Also, we're coming to the
of one thing which I want to add, just reminded me of, like, there was one podcast which I was listening, Robert Haas, if I'm not mistaken. He was the one who was the guest in that podcast. The podcast is organized by one of the Microsoft folks. He was like, the podcast was revolving around how to become, like, how to commit inside the PostgreSQL, or how to read what is written inside the PostgreSQL, and the ecosystem around that. The questions were related to that. I mean, that could also help. And of course, definitely, when you go to a conference, which we are discussing at the moment, there you'll find a good answer. But yeah, listening to that podcast will help you give the answers to an extent.
Yeah, I think that's the Talking Postgres with Claire Giordano, or if it was the
Yes.
previous version, it was the Path to Citus con, because that's what it was called before, I think. We need to, like, finish this puppy up, but maybe David, you shared that doc in the chat, but for the recording, can you also talk about what you shared there?
Yeah, but the summit that's in Montreal on May 13th is a sort of unconference session. We have a limited amount of time, so we want to collect topic ideas and kind of ad hoc votes for ideas of things to discuss. Last year, I used a website with Post-its. This year, I'm just trying to spreadsheet. So I posted a link to the Google Sheets, which anybody in the world can access and put in great ideas and star the ideas they're really interested in talking about. And I really appreciate people contributing to that. I think some good topics came up today, honestly. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for joining. So thank you for our panelists specifically for sharing their experiences. And this episode, like all the others, will be uploaded to YouTube, and then captions and sort of the transcript will follow soon after, or as quickly as I can type.